I had just finished checking the fences around my ranch after a long day in the sun. The smell of hay and leather, the soft sound of cows chewing in the distance. It was the kind of peace you only find in a place you call your own. I was ready to kick back, maybe pour myself a cold drink, and forget about the world outside these acres. Little did I know, the world outside had already forgotten me. I walked to the mailbox, the kind of old, slightly crooked mailbox that's been leaning to one side for years but somehow still manages to hold everything it's supposed to. Inside, there was a stack of envelopes, mostly junk, but one envelope had my name in big official letters. It was from the HOA. Normally, I toss their letters aside or glance at the fine notices with a sigh. After all, who actually reads the tiny print in those documents? But something about this envelope made my stomach tighten. Maybe it was the thick paper, or the way it felt heavier than usual. I opened it slowly, expecting another ridiculous fine about a mailbox or landscaping issue. Instead, my eyes skimmed the first few lines and I froze. My ranch, my land, my home had been given away. At least that's what the letter said. Somehow the HOA had signed documents transferring a portion of my property to someone else. Someone I didn't know. Someone I certainly hadn't authorized. I read it again, thinking maybe I was misunderstanding. Maybe it was a clerical error. But no. It was clear, official, and terrifying. I felt a mix of disbelief and anger bubbling inside me. My brain kept repeating the words, "They gave it away, without asking me." I couldn't even imagine how they thought this was acceptable. I walked around my yard, shaking my head, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was one of those dreams that feels real for a second before you wake up. Except I wasn't dreaming. The paper was real, and the signatures were real, and my blood pressure was spiking faster than I thought possible. After a few deep breaths, I realized what this meant. They hadn't just crossed some bureaucratic line, they had crossed a line that was mine. My ranch was more than dirt and fences. It was years of work, sweat, and memories. Every corner held a story: the old oak tree where I'd taught my kids to climb, the barn where I'd spent nights repairing fences, the pond where I'd watched sunsets that no one else seemed to notice. And now, part of it was being handed over like some HOA tchotchke. I went back inside and called a friend who lived nearby, someone who understood the absurdities of dealing with homeowners associations. "You're not going to believe this," I said, voice tight with a mix of panic and disbelief. I explained the letter, reading parts of it aloud. My friend let out a long whistle. "Wait, they can't do that. That's insane. It's your property." I knew it, but hearing it confirmed made it hit even harder. I wasn't just angry anymore, I was plotting. I had to figure out how this had happened, and more importantly, how to undo it. As I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the letter again, a strange thought crossed my mind. The whole situation was absurd. Who actually gave away someone's ranch without asking? It was the kind of thing you read about in newspapers or maybe see in a TV show, but it wasn't supposed to happen to normal people like me. And yet here it was. The paper sat there, staring back at me, daring me to challenge it. I could almost hear it whispering, "Good luck." I realized then that I had two choices. I could panic, call a lawyer, and wait nervously while the HOA made every day a new nightmare, or I could fight. And I'm not someone who takes the easy path. I had spent years building this ranch, facing droughts, broken fences, and stubborn cows. I wasn't about to let a piece of paper and some self-important administrators take away what I'd worked for. So I took a deep breath, straightened the envelope on the table, and made a promise to myself. I was going to get my ranch back, whatever it took. Whatever tricks, loopholes, or stubbornness were necessary, I would reclaim my land. And I had a feeling that the people who thought they could steal it from me were about to find out just how wrong they were. Little did I know, the first person I would have to face was the president of the HOA herself, and she was about to make this entire ordeal even more ridiculous. I didn't waste any time after reading that outrageous letter. If the HOA thought they could just hand away my land and expect me to shrug it off, they were about to learn a very important lesson. I picked up the phone and dialed the number on the letter, trying to calm my racing thoughts. When she answered, I knew immediately I was in trouble, not for the ranch, but for my patience. Her voice was sharp, clipped, and far too cheerful for the situation. "Hello, this is HOAKaren, HOA president. How can I help you?" she said, like she hadn't just orchestrated one of the most infuriating things I'd ever seen in my life. I swallowed my anger and explained the situation, keeping my tone calm even though I was boiling inside. She didn't skip a beat. She rattled off some rules, dates, and meeting minutes I had never seen before. Apparently, according to some obscure clause buried in a document that must have been written in another language, they had every right to reallocate property within the community. I tried to respond, pointing out that my ranch had been mine for decades, but she interrupted with the kind of confidence that only someone completely convinced they are always right can muster. "Sir, you're misunderstanding the process," she said, her tone sharp but somehow annoyingly polite. "I followed all proper procedures, and as the HOA president, my actions are final." I stared at my phone. The idea that she thought she could say, "I did it, and that's final," and have it stick made my blood pressure climb. I wanted to laugh and scream at the same time. She had no idea who she was messing with. I had wrestled bulls, fixed collapsing barns, and spent entire nights in the rain patching fences with nothing but determination and duct tape. She was just Karen, a human obstacle in my path. "Final?" I asked slowly, choosing my words like a gunfighter drawing at high noon. "You think you can just give away someone's property and it's final?" "Yes," she said, as if saying it once made it true. "It's all legal. There's nothing you can do." At that moment, I realized this was going to be a longer, uglier battle than I had imagined. Her confidence was infuriating, but it also gave me an idea. If she thought this was final, then she clearly underestimated the people she was dealing with. I smiled to myself, trying not to let it show over the phone. She wouldn't know what hit her. The conversation continued with her citing more rules, fines, and irrelevant precedents, each more ridiculous than the last. She spoke as if she were giving a lecture, while I felt like I was trapped in a surreal comedy. At one point, she even suggested that I could perhaps negotiate a compromise if I was willing to attend a meeting next week. I nearly laughed into the phone. A meeting, while strangers were walking on my land. No, this wasn't about compromise, it was about ownership. After nearly 20 minutes of her spouting regulations I had never seen, I finally interrupted. "Listen, Karen, you've crossed a line. This isn't about fines or meetings. This is my land. You don't get to just take it away." She paused, probably expecting me to back down. I stayed silent, letting the weight of my words hang in the air. I could almost hear her calculating, trying to figure out how to maintain control while I stood my ground. But I wasn't moving. I had dealt with tougher problems than her. A stubborn administrator was nothing compared to a bull in a thunderstorm. Finally, she sighed, a deep, dramatic sigh like the world was unbearably inconvenient because of me. "Well," she said slowly, "perhaps we can find a solution, but the rules are clear and I'm just enforcing them." I hung up the phone, trying not to pace in circles in the kitchen. My ranch wasn't safe yet. In fact, it was more threatened than ever. But one thing was clear. Karen had just shown me her confidence, and I had already started planning my counterattack. If she thought she could intimidate me with rules and bureaucracy, she was about to find out that I had a very different set of tools: stubbornness, creativity, and years of knowing every inch of my property. I grabbed a notebook, started jotting ideas, and even sketched a rough layout of the ranch, thinking about how I could protect what was mine. The anger fueled me, but so did the absurdity of it all. There was something almost cinematic about standing in my kitchen, plotting a comeback against a woman who thought she could steal my land with a smile. And in that moment, I realized that the fight had officially begun. Karen had underestimated me, and that was a mistake she would soon regret. Little did I know, the next steps I would take would not only defend my ranch, but also teach her a lesson she would never forget. The next morning, I couldn't wait any longer. I had to see it with my own eyes. My stomach twisted as I drove down the gravel road that led to the affected portion of my ranch. The sun was just peeking over the hills, casting long shadows across the fields. Everything looked normal at first, the cows grazing quietly, the barn standing tall, but then I saw it. Stakes had been driven into the ground, bright orange flags fluttering in the breeze, marking boundaries that weren't boundaries at all. There were fresh tire tracks cutting across the pasture, and in the distance, a few strangers were walking, talking, and laughing as if they belonged there. My blood ran cold. It wasn't just a letter anymore, it was real. Someone had stepped onto my property, onto land that had been mine for decades, and the HOA was letting it happen. I stopped my truck at the edge of the field and just stared. My ranch was more than dirt and grass. It was years of hard work, sweat, and memories. The old oak tree where my kids had climbed and fallen countless times, the barn where I had patched countless broken beams in the dead of night, the pond where I had watched sunsets that no one else seemed to notice. It was all mine. And now, strangers were walking on it like it meant nothing. I wanted to run over, shout, demand they leave, but I knew that would only escalate things. Instead, I took a deep breath and started walking toward the closest group of people. My boots crunched on the gravel and dirt as I approached, and they finally noticed me. One of them, a man holding a clipboard, looked confused, like he had never seen a rancher before. Are you the owner?" he asked, pointing at me like I was some mythical creature that had wandered into their territory. "Yeah, I'm the owner," I said, trying to keep my voice calm but steady, letting the tension build. "And you need to leave my property." He looked at me nervously and muttered something about the HOA having permission to be here. I felt a laugh bubbling up, half anger, half disbelief. Permission? From the people who had no right to give it in the first place? The absurdity was almost comical. After a tense few minutes, they packed up and left, but the damage was already done. I walked the land, inspecting every corner, imagining the worst-case scenarios. It was clear that this wasn't just a small issue. The HOA had crossed a line and I had to respond, but carefully. One wrong move and they could escalate things in ways I didn't want. As I stood there, staring at my land, I remembered something a neighbor had told me a few weeks ago. If you ever have a dispute with the HOA, check the fine print. They always miss something. I had brushed it off then, thinking nothing like this could happen to me. Now I was desperate enough to follow that advice. I needed to know every loophole, every rule, every tiny technicality that could help me. If they thought they could just take my ranch, they had another thing coming. I went back to my truck and pulled out my laptop. I started digging through HOA regulations, local property laws, and any legal documents I could find. It was tedious work, sifting through pages of bureaucratic nonsense, but I felt a spark of hope. Somewhere in all this fine print, there had to be a way to fight back. There had to be a way to protect what was mine. As I worked, ideas started forming. I could build something that no one could ignore, something that physically marked my territory and made it impossible for anyone to step onto my land without my permission. It wasn't just about defense. It was about sending a message. The more I thought about it, the more excited I became. I could feel the plan taking shape, like a fire starting slowly and growing brighter with each passing minute. And yet a small part of me was nervous. This wasn't just paperwork anymore. If I moved too quickly, the HOA could come after me legally, trying to intimidate me. I had to be smart, careful, and methodical. Every step had to be calculated. And somehow I knew that when the time came, Karen would be more than surprised. She would regret ever underestimating me. I looked out over my ranch one more time, the sun climbing higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the fields. My land was mine, no matter what the letter said. I clenched my fists, feeling a mix of anger and determination. The fight had begun, and I was ready. Little did I know, the first step in my plan would be the most satisfying and ridiculous thing Karen had ever seen. The idea had come to me fully formed, and all that remained was to turn it into reality. After walking the land that morning and seeing the damage the HOA had done, I sat down on the tailgate of my truck, trying to calm my mind. Anger was still simmering, but slowly a plan began to form. If the HOA thought they could just take my ranch with a signature and a smile, they were sorely mistaken. I needed something tangible, something that made it impossible for anyone to cross my land without my permission. And then it hit me. A fence. Not just any fence, but a fence that would make Karen regret every smug word she had ever said. I started sketching ideas in a notebook. I measured the perimeter, knotting every corner, every slope, every tree that could be used for support. The fence had to be tall enough to be imposing, strong enough to withstand any attempt at dismantling, and creative enough to send a message without breaking the law. As I drew, I could feel excitement creeping in, a thrill that made the earlier panic fade into determination. Building the fence would take time and effort, but I wasn't worried. I had built barns, corrals, and even a pond on this land. This was just another project, except this one had a high-stakes purpose. I imagined Karen's face when she saw it, her smug confidence crumbling into disbelief. It made me grin despite the frustration still lingering from the HOA's audacity. Over the next few days, I prepared for the work. I visited the hardware store, buying posts, wire, and tools. I made mental notes about the order in which I would tackle the sections, how to start at the corners, and how to ensure it was secure from both animals and unwanted humans. The process was methodical, almost military in precision, and I found myself slipping into a zone of focus where nothing else existed except me and the land. Neighbors started noticing my activity and stopped by, curious about all the materials scattered along the driveway. I waved them over and explained vaguely that I was reinforcing my boundaries, careful not to reveal the full plan. A few chuckled at my enthusiasm, but others nodded in silent support. It was comforting to know that I wasn't alone in this fight, that people understood when the HOA overstepped. As I began installing the first posts, I could almost hear Karen complaining in her high-pitched, self-important tone. Imagining her packing in her office, reviewing documents that no longer mattered, gave me a strange sense of satisfaction. Each post I drove into the ground was a small victory, a physical reminder that my land belonged to me and me alone. Evening came and I paused to look at the progress. The first section of the fence stood straight and tall, a barrier that was more than metal and wood. It was defiance made real. I took a sip of water, wiped sweat from my brow, and felt a surge of pride. Karen may have had rules, letters, and signatures, but I had something stronger, control over my own property and the determination to protect it. As the days passed, the fence grew. It was long, strong, and deliberate. Each section added brought a new layer of tension because I knew the HOA would notice eventually. I imagined their reaction: surprise, disbelief, anger. They had never faced someone willing to act so boldly, and I couldn't wait to see the moment they realized their threats meant nothing against a physical, undeniable boundary. But I also had to be careful. Karen was cunning, and I knew she would try to escalate, maybe even involve legal measures or law enforcement. Every post, every wire had to comply with local laws. It had to be perfect, both for strength and legality. The last thing I wanted was to give her a reason to take me to court while my fence was still unfinished. By the end of the week, a significant portion of the fence was up. It was impressive, commanding attention without being aggressive. I stood back, surveying my work, and felt a sense of calm and readiness. This fence wasn't just about keeping people out. It was a statement, a promise, and a warning all at once. Karen had pushed too far, and now the land had a guardian. And deep down, I knew the real showdown was coming. Karen had no idea what she was about to face, and I was ready to enjoy every moment of her reaction. The fence was more than wood and wire. It was my ticket to regaining control, and the next chapter of this battle was about to begin. I had barely finished the last section of the fence when the phone started ringing. At first, I ignored it, thinking it might be a neighbor or a local vendor. But then I saw the caller ID, HOA headquarters. My stomach sank, but I didn't panic. This was coming, and I had been preparing for it. When I answered, Karen's voice came through loud and shrill, dripping with indignation. "Sir, I see what you're doing out there," she said, her tone sharp and almost theatrical. "That fence is unacceptable. It violates multiple rules and could result in fines." I leaned against the counter, smiling to myself. She had no idea that every post, every wire, every corner had been carefully measured and documented to comply with local laws. Legally, I was untouchable. And yet, hearing her threaten me with fines and inspections was almost comical. She clearly thought she could intimidate me. "Karen," I said slowly, "the fence is within all legal limits. You can send all the letters, fines, or inspections you want. It won't change the fact that this is my land and I am securing it." There was a pause on the line, followed by a sigh so dramatic I imagined her throwing herself onto a velvet chair and fanning her face. "This isn't over," she snapped. "We are escalating this. Inspections will be scheduled and legal action may follow." I hung up and stepped outside, looking at the fence. Each section now stood tall and imposing, a clear boundary between my property and the world. I walked along the length, running my hands over the wire and posts. There was something deeply satisfying about creating a physical barrier against nonsense, bureaucracy, and self-important administrators. That evening, a group of inspectors arrived. I knew they were coming. They always came when the HOA felt threatened. They walked around the property with clipboards and measuring tapes, looking confused at every turn. One of them even asked me where the official boundary line was, clearly unaware that the documents they carried were meaningless without my signature. I led them along the fence, answering questions politely, carefully, and legally. The frustration on their faces was palpable, and I fought back laughter as they struggled to find violations where none existed. Karen had assumed that sheer persistence and paperwork would win the day. She had no idea that knowledge, preparation, and a well-built fence were stronger than any letter or threat. Over the next few days, the HOA tried every tactic they could think of: letters, phone calls, and even the suggestion of legal hearings. I responded to each calmly, providing documentation and evidence that the fence complied with all regulations. Every time they escalated, I escalated back, not with anger but with confidence and preparation. My neighbors started noticing the commotion. Some came by to offer support, sharing stories of their own battles with the HOA. It was strange how a conflict that had begun with letters and signatures had become a local spectacle. I smiled at the thought. Karen was underestimating the ripple effect of her actions. The more she tried to push, the more attention she drew, and the more she looked ridiculous in the process. One afternoon, as I tightened the last few bolts on a gate, I imagined Karen packing her office, trying to figure out how to regain control. She probably had a stack of papers, rules, and regulations spread out like a battle plan, none of which mattered. The fence stood firm, unyielding, and completely within the law. She couldn't cross it, and that realization was going to hit her hard. Yet despite the satisfaction, I knew the conflict wasn't over. Karen was determined, and she wouldn't give up without a fight. I needed to prepare for her next move, whatever it might be. Legal threats, more inspections, or even attempts to intimidate me in person were all possibilities. But I was ready. I had the fence, the law, and determination on my side, and I wasn't about to let her win. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the ranch, I stood at the edge of the fence and looked back at my land. It was mine, and I had defended it. The battle had escalated, yes, but so had my confidence. Karen had made one critical mistake. She had underestimated me, and when the final showdown came, she was going to realize that nothing short of a legal miracle could take my ranch from me. And deep down, I knew the best part was yet to come. The moment she saw the fence fully completed, standing tall and unyielding, she would understand the true meaning of being challenged, and she would regret ever thinking she could control my property. After weeks of measuring, digging, and installing posts, the fence was finally complete. It stretched across the property like a silent guardian, tall, sturdy, and impossible to ignore. I stood back and admired my work, feeling a sense of satisfaction that went beyond physical labor. This fence wasn't just wood and wire. It was a statement, a warning, and proof that my ranch was mine and mine alone. I knew Karen would notice it immediately. She had already made her threats, sent inspectors, and tried to intimidate me with paperwork. Now she was going to face something tangible, something undeniable. I could almost see her reaction in my mind. Disbelief turning to frustration, frustration turning to panic. It made me grin despite the lingering anger from the HOA's audacity. Later that morning, I saw her car pull up near the edge of the property. She stepped out, clipboard in hand, heels clicking against the gravel, exuding that same confidence that had made me so angry in the first place. But as she walked closer and finally saw the fence in its full glory, her confident expression faltered. I had imagined this moment countless times, and it was even better in reality. "What is this?" she asked, her voice sharp but tinged with disbelief. She stepped closer, peering over the top of the fence as if expecting it to vanish if she looked hard enough. "This is my land," I said calmly, walking up to the gate. "And this is how I protect it. You may have your letters and rules, but this fence is within all legal limits, and it marks exactly where my property begins and ends." Her eyes darted from the fence to me, then back to her clipboard, as if searching for some loophole that didn't exist. I stayed calm, meeting her gaze steadily. For the first time, she looked unsure, like she had no clear path to assert control. That hesitation was satisfying, a sign that the power had shifted. "Sir, you can't just build a fence like this," she said finally, trying to regain some authority. "It violates HOA regulations. We will be taking action." "Take all the action you want," I replied evenly, "but the law is on my side and so is the fence." Her face twisted with frustration, and she muttered something under her breath. I could tell she wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone she assumed she could control. The fence had leveled the playing field. It was no longer about letters and threats. It was about reality, and reality clearly favored me. Over the next hour, she circled the perimeter, inspecting every post, every wire, as if hoping to find some flaw I had overlooked. But the fence was solid, legal, and uncompromising. I watched her, quietly amused as her confidence eroded with each step. She had underestimated me, and now she was paying the price. Neighbors began to gather quietly in the background, drawn by the drama. Some whispered encouragement, others just observed. It was strange, watching Karen fume while the fence stood silently, almost mocking her with its mere presence. I felt a rush of pride knowing that the work of my hands had created more than a barrier. It had created leverage, power, and a sense of inevitability that Karen couldn't ignore. As the sun climbed higher, casting shadows across the land, Karen finally turned to leave, muttering about legal action and inspections. I watched her retreat, knowing that this was only the beginning. She would not give up easily, but the fence had changed the game. The physical barrier was now a symbol of my resolve, and nothing she could do would erase that. I walked along the length of the fence, running my hands along the posts, feeling the strength of each connection. The land behind it was mine, and the future looked promising. I knew there would be more challenges, more attempts to undermine me, but for now, I had the upper hand. The fence was complete, and the showdown had begun. As I stood there, surveying the property, I realized something important. Karen had not expected me to fight back. She had assumed compliance, obedience, and fear. Instead, she was facing someone who was prepared, determined, and completely unafraid. The realization alone was enough to make her mistakes irreversible. And I smiled, knowing that the next steps would not only protect my ranch, but also teach her a lesson she would never forget. The fence was more than a structure, it was a statement. And Karen was about to learn, the hard way, that underestimating me was her first and biggest mistake. After the initial confrontation with Karen, I knew the battle wasn't over. She had retreated, muttering threats about legal action and inspections, but I could feel her frustration radiating like heat off a summer road. I had the fence, yes, but Karen was cunning. She wouldn't just walk away quietly. I needed a move that would not only protect my land, but also ensure she regretted ever thinking she could control it. I spent the next few days researching every rule, loophole, and document related to the HOA, property boundaries, and local ordinances. It was tedious work, filled with legal jargon and bureaucratic language, but as I sifted through it, patterns began to emerge. There were gaps in the HOA's procedures, rules they had failed to follow, and signatures missing from critical forms. It was the perfect opportunity. With each discovery, my plan became clearer. Karen had assumed power because she relied on intimidation and paperwork that she hadn't even executed properly. Now, I had the evidence to not only reinforce my ownership, but also to turn her own rules against her. It was a quiet, methodical process, one that required patience, precision, and a little bit of cunning. I started documenting everything. The date I built the fence, photographs of the completed structure, copies of the documents that showed the HOA's errors. I even made a detailed map of the property, highlighting every corner, every post, every inch of land Karen had tried to claim. This wasn't just preparation, it was ammunition. Then came the fun part. I contacted the local property office and double-checked the official records. Every misstep the HOA had made was verified and recorded. It was astonishing how many small errors Karen had made in her overconfidence. Each one was a thread that, when pulled, would unravel her entire claim. I couldn't help but smile at the thought of her realizing all at once that she had built her power on sand. Next, I reached out to a few neighbors quietly, people who had been watching the drama unfold. They were more than willing to support me, providing statements about when the fence was built, how it aligned with legal boundaries, and even anecdotes about Karen's overreach. Their testimony would be invaluable if she tried to escalate legally. The support was subtle but strong, like an invisible shield surrounding my property. Finally, I scheduled a meeting with Karen, not at the ranch, but at the local HOA office. I walked in calmly with my folder of documents and photographs under my arm. Her eyes widened when she saw me, and I could sense a flicker of unease she hadn't shown before. She had assumed compliance. Instead, she faced someone prepared, organized, and confident. "Hello, Karen," I said evenly. "I wanted to review the documents regarding the land dispute. It seems there are some discrepancies that need clarification." Her confidence wavered as I laid out the evidence. Missing signatures, improper notifications, procedural errors, and photographic proof of my completed fence. Every misstep, every assumption she had made was now on the table, undeniable and clear. She tried to interrupt, to argue, to assert her authority, but I stayed calm, letting the evidence speak for itself. It was methodical, unyielding, and most importantly, effective. Slowly, her tone changed from smugness to frustration, then finally to resignation. She had no arguments left, no tools to regain control. She had underestimated me, and now she was paying the price. As I left the office, I felt a sense of triumph. The fence had done more than protect my property. It had given me leverage, clarity, and the upper hand. Karen's overconfidence had been her downfall, and the best part was that I hadn't broken a single law or rule. I had simply outsmarted someone who thought intimidation was enough. The neighbors greeted me with quiet smiles when I returned to the ranch. The land behind the fence was mine, fully secured, and Karen had no choice but to back down. It was satisfying in a way that went beyond victory. It was proof that preparation, patience, and cleverness could turn even the most frustrating situation into a win. And deep down, I knew that when Karen finally realized the extent of her mistakes, she would regret ever thinking she could take what was mine. The fence wasn't just a barrier. It was a symbol of resolve, and I had reinforced it with strategy and wit. The battle was nearly over, but the satisfaction of turning the tables on Karen was something I would savor for a long time. The ranch was safe, my boundaries were clear, and the lesson was delivered. And I couldn't wait to see Karen's face when she finally accepted that she had lost. The days after the showdown were quiet, almost surreal. Karen had retreated, and the letters and threats that once flooded my mailbox had stopped. The fence stood tall across the property, a physical and symbolic boundary that no one could cross without my permission. For the first time in weeks, I could breathe again and actually enjoy the ranch that I had worked so hard to protect. I walked along the fence line one morning, running my hands over the posts and wire, feeling the solidity of each connection. It was more than a structure. It was the embodiment of persistence, preparation, and a refusal to back down. Every corner, every gate, every inch represented a small victory in a battle that had begun with a single outrageous letter. Neighbors began stopping by, offering congratulations, sharing stories, and quietly celebrating with me. Some admitted they had always felt powerless against the HOA's overreach, but seeing me stand up, fight back, and win gave them hope. It was strange to think that one stubborn rancher's determination could ripple across the community, inspiring others to question authority when it overstepped. As the sun rose higher, I decided to take a walk through the property that had been the center of so much tension. The cows grazed peacefully, the barn stood as solid as ever, and the pond reflected the morning sky in perfect stillness. It reminded me why I had fought so fiercely. This land wasn't just dirt, wood, and water. It was home. It held memories, sweat, and countless hours of work that no one could ever take from me, not even Karen or her HOA. Even though the battle was over, I couldn't resist one last symbolic gesture. I added a small plaque to the gate, marking it as protected property, not in anger, but in triumph. It was a quiet nod to the struggle and a reminder that persistence and careful planning could overcome even the most audacious attempts at control. And then came the unexpected moment. Karen herself appeared standing across the street observing the fence. She didn't approach, didn't argue, and didn't speak. Her posture was stiff, her expression a mix of frustration and disbelief. I could almost see the realization settling in that she had lost, that the clever twists and careful documentation had left her powerless. It was a strange, satisfying moment, one that made all the late nights, research, and labor feel worth it. I didn't confront her. There was no need. The fence, the legal paperwork, and the community's quiet support spoke louder than any words ever could. She had learned the hard way that underestimating someone determined to protect what was theirs was a mistake she wouldn't forget. And as she walked away, I felt a sense of closure that was both calming and exhilarating. That evening, I sat on the porch with a cold drink in hand, watching the sun set over the hills. The ranch was peaceful again, and for the first time in weeks, I could truly relax. The fence had done its job, not just in protecting the land, but in restoring a sense of control and pride. It was a reminder that sometimes, standing firm and thinking strategically could turn even the most frustrating situations into victories. As I watched the shadows lengthen across the fields, I realized something important. The fight had never been just about the fence or the land. It had been about boundaries, respect, and refusing to let someone else dictate what belonged to me. Karen had tried to take that from me, but in the end, persistence, preparation, and clever thinking had won. And with a smile, I looked out over my ranch, fully secure, and knew one thing for certain. No letter, no threat, and no overconfident HOA president would ever take what was mine again. The fence stood tall, the land was safe, and I had learned a lesson that went beyond property. It was a lesson in determination, courage, and the power of standing up for yourself. The ranch was mine, the fight was over, and the story of how a stubborn rancher, a clever fence, and a little bit of strategy had outsmarted the HOA would be remembered for a long time. And as I turned to head inside, I knew that if anyone ever tried again, they would find the fence, and the resolve behind it, completely unyielding. You've heard this confession, now wait until you hear the next one. The truth that shatters everything you thought you knew.